The scent of cedar and old paper filled the air, a heavy perfume of memory and loss. Alex ran a hand over the dust-sheeted shapes in his father's study, each silhouette a ghost of a life now still. The official story was a climbing accident in the Andes, a sudden fall. A clean, tragic end for a man who had always been a distant peak in Alex's life, respected, admired, but never truly scaled. The task of dismantling this inner sanctum felt like a final, futile attempt to understand him. He started with the bookshelves, packing away thick volumes on geology and polar exploration. His father, Dr. Aris Thorne, had been a man of science, his passions as cold and remote as the places he studied. It was beneath a stack of topographical maps of Antarctica that Alex's fingers brushed against something that did not belong. Tucked into a hollow space behind a false back of the lowest shelf was a bundle, tightly wrapped in stiff, yellowed oilcloth and bound with coarse twine. The package was heavy, dense with secrets. The twine snapped with a dry crack, and the oilcloth fell away to reveal a journal. Its cover was of aged, scarred leather, unmarked, but possessing a palpable weight of years. He opened it carefully, the spine protesting with a soft groan. The pages within were filled with his father's precise, angular handwriting, a script Alex knew from birthday cards and infrequent postcards. But the content was alien. The first page was dated July 1986, and the heading was not the title of a scientific paper, but 3 stark words: Operation Silent Frost. Alex sank into his father's worn leather chair, the journal a cold weight on his lap. He began to read, and the familiar study with its view of the London rain dissolved, replaced by a world of blinding white and profound cold. The entries were not dry field notes. They were a chronicle of unease. His father wrote of arriving at a remote Antarctic base, of the oppressive silence that was more than mere absence of sound. He described seismic readings that defied explanation, vibrations that registered on sensitive equipment as a deep, rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat from the planet's core. As he turned the pages, the scientific detachment began to fray. The entries grew more frantic, the handwriting occasionally losing its precision, becoming a spidery scrawl. There were sketches, not of rock strata or ice cores, but of bizarre geometric symbols that seemed to writhe on the page. Notes in the margin spoke of non-terrestrial material analysis and acoustic phenomena of unknown origin. One phrase, heavily underlined, sent a chill down Alex's spine that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. They are not echoes. They are answers. A deep and unsettling curiosity took root, a compulsion to follow this thread into the darkness of his father's past. This was not the man he knew, the reserved academic, the emotionally absent parent. This was a man on the edge of a terrifying discovery, a man haunted by something he could not name. The journal was a crack in the foundation of the world. Alex had understood, and through it he could feel a freezing wind blowing, carrying whispers of ice, of secrets buried deep, and of a truth about his father that was far more terrifying and far more real than a simple climbing accident. The oilcloth lay discarded on the floor like a shed skin, its purpose fulfilled. The journal now sat fully exposed on the desk, its scarred leather cover seeming to drink the dim light of the study. Alex's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a stark counterpoint to the quiet hum of the city outside. He had found the hidden thing, the secret his father had deliberately concealed behind a wall of maps. Now he had to confront its contents. He opened the cover again, his fingers tracing the date scrawled in dark ink at the top of the first page. February 14th, 1987. Arrival. The handwriting was the familiar, disciplined script of Dr. Harris Thorne. A man who valued order above all else. But as Alex began to read, he sensed a tremor in that order, a hairline fracture in his father's scientific resolve. The entry described a landing on a vast, white plain, the sky a pale, endless bowl. His father wrote of the journey in a twin propeller plane, the shuddering violence of the descent through katabatic winds that screamed like damned souls against the fuselage. The base, designated only as Outpost K7, was a cluster of low, utilitarian structures half buried in snowdrifts, a mere speck of human ambition against the continental expanse of ice. His father's words painted a picture of stark, brutal beauty, but beneath the clinical observations, a deeper unease festered. He wrote of the silence. It was not the mere absence of noise, but an active, pressing force. It was a vacuum that seemed to swallow sound, thought, and time itself. The usual clamor of a research station, the generator's hum, the chatter of personnel, the wind's constant moan was absent. The team, a mix of geologists and engineers, moved through the prefabricated corridors with a hushed, almost reverential caution. The initial days were spent in calibration and setup, routines his father documented with methodical detail. Yet, the silence was a character in every sentence, an ever-present observer. Then, the readings began. It started as a faint, persistent tremor on the seismographs, a signal so low and consistent it was initially dismissed as equipment resonance or the distant calving of a glacier. But his father, ever the meticulous scientist, had noted its peculiar regularity. It was not the chaotic shudder of tectonic shifts or ice movement. It was a pulse, a deep, subsonic thrum that registered as a clean, repeating wave on the graph paper. A heartbeat his father had written, and then scratched the word out so forcefully the pen had torn the paper, but the impression remained. A ghost in the fiber. The entry for the following week grew more agitated. The pulse intensified, its frequencies subtly shifting in patterns that defied natural explanation. Other instruments began to pick up anomalies, strange magnetic fluctuations that sent compass needles spinning wildly, and faint, ultra-low frequency acoustic emissions that the microphones captured as a sound like stone grinding against stone, emanating from deep beneath the ice sheet. The team's initial professional curiosity curdled into a pervasive dread. The base commander, a military man named Riggs, imposed strict communication blackouts, citing atmospheric interference. Alex could feel the walls of the outpost closing in on his father through the ink on the page. The man who had arrived with a head full of data and theories was now confronting something that shattered those very frameworks. The final paragraph of the entry was written in a hazier hand, the letter slanting forward as if rushing toward a conclusion. The silence is not empty, his father had concluded. It is listening. And the pulse is its answer. We are not alone down here. We are guests in a house that was never meant for us, and the owner has just stirred in his sleep. Alex slowly closed the journal, the soft thud of the cover, a definitive sound in the quiet room. The inheritance was no longer just a book. It was a key, and he had just unlocked the first, chilling door into his father's frozen nightmare. The journal fell open to a page where the disciplined script of earlier entries began to fracture. Here, the handwriting lost its military precision, becoming a frantic, spidery scrawl that crowded the margins and spiraled around the main text. Alex leaned closer, the lamplight pooling on the page, illuminating his father's descent into a mystery that had clearly consumed him. The words were no longer just recorded observations. They were the frantic etchings of a mind grappling with the incomprehensible. He found the sketches first. They were not the clean, labeled diagrams of a scientist, but dark, obsessive renderings that seemed to have been drawn with a desperate, trembling hand. They depicted bizarre, geometric symbols interlocking spirals that had no beginning or end, angular patterns that hurt the eyes to follow, and shapes that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. One, drawn heavily in black ink, resembled a twisted lattice of veins or a frozen lightning strike. And next to it, his father had written a single chilling question: language or anatomy? Alex's own breath caught in his throat. He traced the outline of one symbol with his fingertip, the ink raised slightly on the paper. It felt familiar, not in memory, but in his blood. A strange, resonant hum seemed to vibrate up his arm, a phantom sensation born of intense connection. This was his father's hand, the same hand that had once steadied his own on a bicycle, now desperately trying to capture something utterly alien. He turned the page, and his eyes fell on a new heading, underlined twice: analysis of recovered non-terrestrial materials. The term non-terrestrial was not used in the speculative tone of a theorist, but with the cold, clinical certainty of a man reporting a fact. The notes described a substance recovered from a deep ice core sample, a dark, metallic alloy that was impossibly light and cold to the touch, a cold that seemed to leach heat from the very air around it. His father documented tests. It did not correspond to any known element on the periodic table. It was non-reactive to strong acids, and it emitted a faint, steady vibration that matched the seismic pulse from the depths. In the margin, in a handwriting so small it was nearly a secret in itself, his father had written, "The ice didn't form around it. The ice grew to contain it." A profound and unsettling connection blossomed within Alex. This was no longer just a historical curiosity or a tragic footnote in his father's life. He was not just reading words. He was witnessing the moment his father's entire understanding of the universe was dismantled. He could feel the man's intellectual excitement warring with a primal fear. The rigorous scientist being forced to confront a reality for which there was no textbook. The journal was a bridge across time and death, and with every turned page, Alex felt himself stepping further into his father's world, a world of blinding white and terrifying silent truths. The cold of that distant continent seemed to seep from the paper, settling deep in his bones, and with it came a terrifying certainty. His father had not been chasing a scientific discovery. He had been fleeing from one. The dreams began that night, swift and merciless as an ice-laden wind. They were not the fragmented, nonsensical images of ordinary sleep, but vivid, sensory assaults that left him gasping and disoriented in the dawn light. He was standing on an endless plain of white, the horizon a razor-sharp line between the pale ice and a sky the color of a fresh bruise. A profound, unnatural cold seeped through his boots, a cold that felt ancient and intelligent. And through that immense silence, he heard them whispers. They were not voices in any language he knew, but a sibilant, rustling, like wind over glacial crevasses, that somehow formed his name. Alex. It was not a call of welcome, but a summons, a hook set deep in his psyche, reeling him in. He would wake with his father's journal clutched to his chest, the leather cover damp with sweat, the geometric symbols from its pages burned onto the back of his eyelids. The line between his waking hours and the dreamscape began to blur. The hum of the London traffic outside his window would momentarily warp into the subsonic pulse his father had described. The shadow of a tree branch against his wall would twist, for a heart-stopping second, into one of the alien sigils. His father's legacy was no longer a mystery contained within a book. It had become haunting. A psychic infection that was rewriting his own reality. For days he moved through his life like a ghost. The mundane world of his job, his friends, his apartment, feeling like a flimsy stage set. The real drama was playing out in the frozen south, a drama his father had left unfinished. The fear was a live wire in his gut, a constant, thrumming warning of the unknown, of the very real possibility of madness or death. He knew, with a chilling certainty he could not logic away, what had happened to the men at Outpost K7 was not a simple accident. It was a confrontation, and his father had been at the very heart of it. The decision did not come as a single thunderous moment of clarity, but as a slow, inexorable tide rising within him. It was there in the way his hand would unconsciously trace the rough twine that had bound the journal. It was in the way he found himself staring at maps of Antarctica for hours, his eyes fixed on the vast blank space where his father's coordinates would lie. The whispers in his dreams were not just echoes of the past. They were a thread, and if he followed it, it might lead him to the truth of his father's fate. It might also lead him into the same abyss. One rain-slicked evening, the city lights smearing like tears on his window, he opened his laptop. The screen glowed in the dark room, a portal to another world. His fingers, cold and trembling slightly, found a travel agency specializing in extreme locations. The cursor hovered over the search bar. He typed 2 words, McMurdo Station. A list of flights, connections, and daunting logistical requirements filled the screen. The cost was astronomical. The physical and psychological preparations, immense. It was the act of a madman, a fool chasing ghosts into the most hostile environment on Earth. He thought of his father's handwriting, the way it had deteriorated from precision to frantic scrawl. He thought of the sketches of things that should not exist, and the notes on a cold that was more than absence of heat. He heard the whisper on the wind of his dream, a sound that promised answers and threatened oblivion in the same breath. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that felt like his first in weeks, Alex selected a flight. He entered his personal details, his passport number, his credit card information. Each keystroke was a deliberate step over a threshold. The final click of the confirm purchase button was a sound of profound finality. The booking confirmation appeared on the screen, its digital text a stark, modern contrast to the oilcloth-wrapped journal beside it. He was going to Antarctica. He was going to walk in his father's footsteps, into the silence that listened, toward the pulse that answered. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now eclipsed by a terrifying, irresistible resolve. The hunt was on. The confirmation email glowed on his screen. A stark digital anchor, tethering him to a course that felt both inevitable and insane. The abstract resolve of the night before now crystallized into a daunting list of practicalities. Alex's small London flat, once a sanctuary of modern comfort, transformed into a staging ground for an expedition into a frozen world. Insulated jackets, thermal layers, and heavy boots began to pile up on his sofa, a mountain of synthetic fabrics and advanced polymers that seemed laughably inadequate against the continent-sized deep freeze his father had described. His research was a deep dive into a world of extreme survival. He learned about frostbite timelines, the deceptive nature of whiteouts, and the critical importance of caloric intake. He pored over satellite images of the transantarctic mountains and the vast, featureless expanse of the East Antarctic ice sheet, trying to imagine his father's small team lost in that immensity. Every piece of gear he acquired felt like a layer of armor, a fragile shield against the unknown. The most crucial piece of his preparation, however, was not something he could buy. It was a name, found buried in the footnotes of an old, declassified research paper on anomalous geomagnetic phenomena, co-authored by his father. Dr. Lena Petrova, a glaciologist, currently stationed at McMurdo. Finding her contact information was a feat of digital archaeology. His first email was carefully worded, a delicate dance between professional inquiry and personal desperation. He presented himself as a historian researching Cold War-era polar missions, focusing on his father's work. He mentioned the journal obliquely as a family document containing unusual observations. The reply, when it came days later, was terse but not dismissive. Dr. Petrova confirmed she had known of Dr. Deferva, Thorne's work, and was familiar with the theoretical models his team had been testing. Her final sentence was a hook that sank deep. The official reports from that season are curiously incomplete. There, gaps. The ice down here has a long memory, and it seldom tells its stories to those who are not prepared to listen. Encouraged, Alex began a fragile correspondence. Lena's emails were guarded, her language peppered with scientific jargon, but he sensed a keen intelligence and a simmering curiosity beneath the professional veneer. She became his tether to the reality of the place, a voice from the very edge of the world confirming that the shadows in his father's journal had substance. This fragile sense of purpose was shattered during a Sunday dinner at his sister's house. The warm, cluttered kitchen, smelling of roast chicken and his nephew's crayons, was a universe away from the sterile white of his dreams. He had hoped for cautious support, or at least a bemused tolerance. Instead, he found a wall of bewildered skepticism. Antarctica, his sister, Claire, had put her wineglass down with a sharp click. Alex, be serious. You're a graphic designer. You get a chill if the central heating dips below 20. Her words were meant to be light, but her eyes were wide with concern. His mother, her face etched with a fresh layer of the grief that had never truly left her, had simply stared at her plate. "Why are you doing this, Alex?" she finally asked, her voice thin. "Your father." That part of his life was a darkness. He came back from that last trip a different man. He wouldn't talk about it. He built a wall around it. And now you want to tear that wall down and go back inside. Their doubts were like cold water, dousing the fire of his conviction. They painted a picture of him as a grieving son chasing ghosts, a man on the verge of a reckless, expensive breakdown. Claire talked about therapy, about healthy closure. His mother pleaded with him to let the past rest. Their love was a cage, its bars woven from logic and concern, and for a terrible moment he felt himself trapped within it. Was he just a fool, mesmerized by his father's madness, destined to vanish into the same white silence? That night, the dream returned with renewed force. He was not just standing on the ice. He was falling through it, down into a blue-black void. And there, suspended in the darkness, was his father. Not the ghost from his memories, but the man from the journal, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with a terrifying mix of fear and awe. Their eyes met, and in that silent, dream-bound connection, Alex felt not a warning, but a desperate, unspoken plea. It was a look that bypassed all logic and reason, a siren call written in a language only his blood could understand. He woke with the certainty, solidifying in his core, cold and hard as Antarctic granite. The doubts of his family were the echoes of the safe, sane world he was leaving behind. The whispers from the ice and the silent plea in his father's eyes were the pull of the truth. The preparations were no longer just a logistical challenge. They were a ritual, a shedding of his old life. He packed the final items, the journal nestled at the very center of his duffel bag, a compass pointing toward a destination that was more than a place on a map. It was a reckoning. The world outside the reinforced porthole was a study in absolute white. The C-130 Hercules, a roaring leviathan of a plane, descended through a sky bleached of all color, its engines fighting the katabatic winds that slammed into the fuselage with the force of a physical blow. Alex felt the vibration deep in his teeth, a constant, grinding tremor that had been his reality for the last 8 hours. Then the wheels shrieked against the blue ice runway, a shocking, violent sound in the vast, sound-absorbing silence of the continent. They had arrived. He was in Antarctica. Stepping out of the plane's heated belly was like stepping onto another planet. The cold was an entity, a living force that stole his breath and needled through his multiple layers of thermal gear in an instant. It was a dry, profound cold, unlike anything he had ever experienced. A cold that felt ancient and utterly indifferent to his presence. The air was painfully pure, searing his lungs with each gasp. Before him, sprawled across the volcanic rock of Ross Island, was McMurdo Station. It was not the isolated outpost of his father's journal, but a small, gritty town of corrugated steel buildings, fuel tanks, and communication towers, all dusted with a fine, blowing snow called spindrift. The utilitarian reality of it was almost a disappointment after the mythic, terrifying place of his dreams. He was directed to a large, warehouse-like building called the Chalet, the station's administrative heart. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of coffee, damp wool, and diesel fuel. He was processing paperwork, his fingers still clumsy with cold, when a woman approached him. She was bundled in a thick red parka, her face framed by a fur-lined hood. But her eyes were what caught him, a sharp, intelligent gray, the color of the sea ice. "Alex Thorne," she said, her voice carrying a faint Eastern European accent. "I am Dr. the Bad, Lena Petrova." She offered a gloved hand, her grip firm and brief. "Your emails did not do justice to the commitment it takes to come here." She led him out of the chalet and into the labyrinth of shipping containers and modular buildings that constituted the station. Her stride was brisk, efficient, a walk born of navigating this harsh environment. They found a relative pocket of shelter between two large Quonset huts. The wind momentarily hushed. Lena turned to him, her gaze appraising. "I knew your father by reputation only." She began, her words forming small clouds in the air. "A brilliant man. Unconventional. The official record of Operation Silent Frost is a masterpiece of bureaucratic omission, a geological survey." She gave a short, humorless laugh that was snatched away by the wind. "We both know it was more." She leaned closer, her voice dropping, though there was no one else in sight. The vast, empty landscape seemed to demand secrecy. "Down here, the official story is just the surface ice. Beneath it, there are currents. Rumors, stories passed down from the old peakers, the veteran researchers. She glanced over her shoulder, a reflexive, almost paranoid gesture. They say that season, the military cordoned off a sector 200 miles southeast of here. No flyovers, no ground traffic. They say the seismic readings from that area were unnatural, not like any tectonic activity on Earth. And they say men came back changed, not just frostbitten or exhausted, but psychologically altered, haunted. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, the journal's frantic entries echoing in his mind. Lena's words were not confirmation, but they were a terrifying validation. The cover-ups, the odd phenomena, they were real. There are other stories, too, she continued, her eyes fixed on the distant, impassive peak of Mount Erebus, its volcanic plume a stark black smear against the white sky, of lights under the ice that move with purpose, of equipment failures that cannot be explained by magnetic storms, of a silence so deep that some men claim to have heard it speak. She looked back at him, her expression grim. Your father was not chasing ghosts, Alex. He was documenting something. Something this continent has kept buried for a very, very long time. And whatever it is, the powers that be went to great lengths to make sure it stayed buried. A profound chill that had nothing to do with the polar air settled deep within Alex. He had arrived seeking answers, and in this stark, alien landscape, he had found a guide who confirmed his deepest fears. The journey into his father's past was no longer a theoretical quest. It had become a tangible, dangerous path leading away from the relative safety of McMurdo Station and into the heart of the ice-bound rumors and the terrifying truth they concealed. The snowmobile's engine was a frantic, buzzing insect against the immense sound-swallowing silence of the Ross Ice Shelf. Alex clung to the handles, his body a tense counterweight, as Lena expertly guided the machine around a pressure ridge, a jagged, frozen wave of ice that had been thrown up by the Titanic, slow-motion collision of glaciers. This was a routine supply run to a remote sensor array, a task Lena had suggested as an introduction to the continent's true face, away from the diesel and coffee thrum of McMurdo. The vastness was staggering, a panoramic emptiness that stretched to a horizon so sharp and clean it looked like a cut in the fabric of the world. The sky above was a pale, luminous gray, but to the south, a faint greenish glow hinted at the auroras that would soon dance in the polar twilight. They were 30 miles out, a mere speck on the infinite white, when the first phenomenon occurred. The radio, which had been crackling with intermittent, broken chatter from McMurdo, suddenly died. Not with a fade or a burst of static, but with an absolute, vacuum-tight silence. A second later, a piercing, atomal shriek erupted from the speaker, a sound like tearing metal and screaming glass that made Alex flinch violently. It lasted for 3 heartbeats, a violation of the natural quiet, and then cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a ringing silence that felt deeper and more profound than before. Lena killed the engine. The sudden quiet was deafening. She tapped the radio, her movements brisk, her face a mask of professional annoyance that didn't quite reach her eyes, which held a glint of sharpened curiosity. atmospheric interference. "It happens," she stated, her voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. But Alex wasn't looking at the radio. He was staring at the southern horizon, where the aurora was now beginning to bloom in earnest. It was not the gentle, shimmering curtain he had seen in photographs. This was something else, entirely. Ribbons of viridian and violet light, twisted not with a languid grace, but in sharp, almost intelligent configurations. They pulsed and throbbed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl across the snow. And in those shadows, Alex saw movement. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the light, the strain on his eyes from the unrelenting whiteness, but it persisted. From the corner of his vision, dark shapes flitted between the undulating waves of light. They were not solid forms, but patches of deeper darkness that moved with a fluid, unsettling purpose, sliding against the direction of the gentle surface wind. They had no discernible shape, one moment a tendril, the next a hunched silhouette, but their motion was unmistakably animate, a cold dread, entirely separate from the ambient temperature, seized him. He fumbled in the inner pocket of his parka, his fingers numb, and pulled out his father's journal. He didn't need to open it. The memory of a specific entry, read and reread in the safety of his London flat, rose in his mind with terrifying clarity. His father had described it exactly: the radio failure, the failure, shrieking static, and then, under the auroral glow, the shadows that are not cast. He had written of forms that slithered at the edge of perception, of a presence that manifested as a stain on reality itself, visible only in the unnatural light of the southern skies. Lena followed his gaze, her professional composure finally cracking. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alex couldn't form the words. He simply pointed toward the pulsating aurora, where one particularly large shadow seemed to coalesce, holding a form that was vaguely, horribly humanoid, for a fleeting second before dissolving back into the chaotic light. He looked from the terrifying spectacle to the journal in his hand and back again. This was no longer a story from the past, a ghost from a dead man's writings. It was here. It was now. The phenomena his father had witnessed and meticulously recorded were not the paranoid fantasies of a man losing his mind in the isolation. They were real. They were repeating, and they were happening to him. The initial academic curiosity that had driven him to this frozen end of the earth was gone, replaced by a visceral, bone-deep certainty that he had stepped directly into his father's nightmare, and the nightmare was wide awake. The return to McMurdo was a silent, haunted journey. The buzzing of the snowmobile's engine did nothing to drown out the memory of those crawling shadows under the aurora's sickly glow. Every gust of wind that whipped stinging ice crystals against his face felt like a cold, probing touch. Lena had said little, her own scientific skepticism visibly shaken by what they had both witnessed, or what Alex had seen and she had felt. The station's scattered lights, appearing on the horizon like a handful of discarded stars, should have been a welcome sight, a return to the fragile bastion of humanity. Instead, they felt like a lie, a flimsy outpost built on the edge of an abyss that was now stirring. back in the cramped, utilitarian confines of his assigned quarters. The silence was different from the vast, open silence of the ice shelf. Here, it was a contained thing, pressurized and heavy. The hum of the base's generators was a constant, low thrum through the insulated walls, a sound he had barely noticed before. Now it felt like the background drone of a sleeping beast. He shed his outer layers, the gear landing in a damp, cold heap on the floor, and slumped onto the narrow bunk, his father's journal a familiar chilling weight in his hands. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The symbols were etched behind his eyes. The descriptions of the pulse were now a memory in his own bones. He must have dozed off the exhaustion of the day and the psychological toll, pulling him into a fitful, shallow sleep. He woke not with a start, but with a slow, creeping awareness that the room was not silent. Beneath the generator's hum, beneath the faint groan of the building settling against the wind, there was something else. A sound so faint it was, less a noise and more a vibration at the very edge of hearing, like the rustle of silk in a distant room, or the hiss of steam through old pipes. He sat up, his senses straining. The sound seemed to coil through the air, directionless, coming from the walls. The vent, the very floor. He held his breath, the blood pounding in his ears, and then he heard it. Not a word, not a language, but a sibilant exhalation that shaped itself, with impossible clarity, into the 2 syllables of his name, Alec. It was not spoken by a voice, but woven from the sound of shifting snow, the creak of ancient ice, and the empty space between atoms. It was a whisper on a wind that could not possibly exist inside the sealed room. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead, a stark contrast to the chill that had taken root in his spine. He stood, his movements jerky, and paced the small space, trying to locate the source. He pressed his ear against the cold metal wall, nothing but the generator's hum. He stood beneath the air vent. Only the recycled, sterile air. The whisper came again, this time from behind him. So close he spun around, expecting to find someone or something in the room with him. There was only his own reflection, pale and wide-eyed, in the dark glass of the window. Alex. It was clearer now, more insistent. It held no emotion, not malice, not welcome. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of his presence, a hook set deep in his consciousness. It was the same whisper from his dreams, but now it was here, in the waking world. Undeniable. This was no longer an echo of his father's experience. It was a direct engagement. The entity, the presence. The whatever it was that his father had encountered knew he was here. It was calling to him. Panic was a live wire, threatening to short-circuit his reason. The rational part of his mind screamed that it was auditory hallucination, a product of stress, isolation, and the thin, cold air. But that part was being drowned out by a deeper, more primal knowing. This was real. The journal was not a history book. It was a field guide to an ongoing event, and he had just become a central character. He looked down at the journal in his trembling hand. The fear was immense, a physical pressure in his chest. But as another whisper curled through the room, this one, a soft, multi-voiced susurration that felt like a question, a new emotion began to burn through the cold dread. It was a fierce, defiant determination. His father had heard these whispers. His father had followed them into the heart of the mystery and had never returned. But he had left a map. He had left a warning. And he had left a son who was no longer a grieving boy, but a man standing at the same precipice. The whispers were not just a haunting. They were a trail. They were proof that he was on the right path, that the truth was not buried and lost, but alive and waiting. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was now fuel. He would find the source of these whispers. He would walk into the white silence and demand the answers his father had died for. Lying back on the bunk, he stared at the ceiling, the faint, intelligible sounds weaving through the air around him. He did not try to block them out. Instead, he listened, letting them sink in, letting them chart his course. The hunt was no longer a quest for closure. It was a confrontation, and the first words had just been spoken. The whispers had faded with the dawn, leaving behind not peace, but a resonant silence that felt charged with intent. The thin and Antarctic light, filtering through the window of his quarters, seemed to illuminate the dust motes in the air with a new, sinister clarity. Alex lay on his bunk, the phantom sibilance of his name still echoing in the chambers of his mind. There was only one refuge, one map that could chart this terrifying new territory. He reached for the journal, its leather cover cold. And familiar. It fell open not to a random page, but to a specific entry, as if the book itself had been waiting for this moment. The date at the top was March 3rd, 1987. The heading, written in his father's hand with a force that had merely torn the paper, was a single momentous phrase: "The dig begins." The transition was immediate and total. The hum of McMurdo's generators vanished, replaced by the howl of a polar gale and the relentless mechanical shriek of the ice drill. Alex was no longer in his bed. He was there, on the vast white plain looking through his father's eyes. The entry was a portal, and he stepped through. His father wrote of the final grueling journey to the coordinates pinpointed by the anomalous seismic pulses. The terrain had been a nightmare of sastrugi sharp, wind-sculpted ridges of ice that tore at their sledges and sapped their strength. The sky was a lid of flat gray cloud, pressing down on them, and the air was so cold it felt solid in the lungs. The military, Commander Riggs, had become a driven, almost fanatical figure, his eyes gleaming with a fervor that had little to do with scientific discovery. The rest of the team, geologists and engineers, moved with a hushed, grim purpose, their earlier dread now hardened into a brittle resolve. They had set up the drill over the epicenter of the pulse, The machinery was a monstrous metal insect. Against the pristine white, its bit a diamond-tipped tooth, designed to chew through millennia of ice. His father described the sound it made as it bit into the frozen crust. Not the expected grind and crunch, but a high-pitched resonant whine, as if the ice itself was screaming. The core samples that came up were not the clear, bubbly cylinders of ancient snowfall. They were veined with threads of that same dark, impossibly light metal he had described earlier, and they were cold, a cold that radiated outward, frosting the gloves of the handlers and making the air around the drill rig shimmer with a strange, heatless mirage. They drilled for 2 days, going deeper than any routine geological survey would warrant. The pulse from below intensified, its rhythm changing, becoming more complex, almost melodic. It was no longer a simple heartbeat. It was a symphony playing from the center of the earth. Then, on the afternoon of the 3rd day, the drill bit broke through into a cavity. There was no sudden drop, no collapse. One moment it was grinding through solid ice, the next it was spinning freely, met by a profound, echoing silence from below. They lowered a borehole camera, its lights a feeble intrusion into the darkness. His father's handwriting became a frantic scrawl, the pen digging into the page. The camera did not reveal a cavern of rock and ice. It showed a smooth, curved surface of a material that defied description. It was black, but it was not matte. It seemed to drink the light from the camera, reflecting nothing, yet it glowed with its own faint, internal luminescence. Deep violet sheen that pulsed in time with the seismic readings. The surface was perfectly, impossibly smooth, without a single seam, rivet, or imperfection. It was not built, it was grown. And then the vibration began. It was not the violent shudder of machinery or the distant rumble of an avalanche. It was a deep subsonic hum that rose up through the ice, through the soles of their boots, and into the marrow of their bones. It was a physical sensation of energy, of immense power held in check. The snow on the ground began to dance, fine crystals levitating a millimeter into the air, caught in the resonant field. The metal of the drill rig began to sing, a harmonic, metallic chorus that was both beautiful and terrifying. His father's final sentences of the entry were written in a hand that was barely legible, the letters staggering across the page as if written during an earthquake. It is not a structure, it is a shell, and something is inside. We have not discovered it. It has allowed us to find it. The vibration. It is not a machine. It is a breath. We are standing on the chest of a sleeping god, and we have just given it a reason to wake up. Alex slowly closed the journal. The vision of that smooth, pulsating surface burned into his mind. The whispers in his room, the shadows under the aurora, they were not the main event. They were the periphery, the emanations. The source was down there, buried in the ice, and it was vast, and it was alive. The coordinates from his father's journal were a brand seared into Alex's mind. A set of numbers that felt less like a location and more like a destination. The journey out of McMurdo Station was a quiet, grim affair. Lena had procured 2 snowmobiles and a week's worth of supplies under the guise of a glaciological survey of a remote ice stream, a fiction that felt flimsy under the weight of their shared, unspoken dread. As they left the scattered lights and industrial noise of the base behind, the immense silence of the continent descended once more, this time feeling less like an absence and more like a presence that watched them go. The first day was a lesson in Antarctic travel, a brutal immersion into a world governed by wind and ice. They followed flagged routes for a time, but soon even those markers vanished, leaving them navigating by GPS and the stark, unforgiving features of the landscape. The wind was a constant, malevolent force. It did not blow, it scowled, screaming down from the polar plateau with a sound like a world tearing itself apart. It found every gap in their gear, needling frozen fingers through zippers and seams, and whipped the surface snow into a blinding, stinging haze that reduced visibility to a few meters. They wore goggles, but the world was still a white howling fury, a monochrome hell where the horizon ceased to exist, and the sky merged with the ground in a seamless, dizzying blur. It was on the second day that the anomalies began. The first sign was the GPS. One moment it showed their position with crisp, digital certainty. The next, the screen flickered, the coordinates scrambling into nonsense before resetting. Lena checked her own unit, her brow furrowed in frustration. Magnetic interference, she shouted over the gale, but her eyes betrayed a deeper concern. The compasses were worse. Their needles did not point north. They spun in lazy, erratic circles, as if drunk before sometimes locking onto a direction that felt fundamentally wrong, pointing toward a featureless expanse of ice with the unnerving certainty. The disorientation was more than navigational. A strange pressure headache began to build behind Alex's eyes, a dull throb that pulsed in time with a sound he could not hear, but could feel in his teeth. It was the subsonic hum from his father's journal, the vibration of the structure. Now, a palpable force in the air itself. The world seemed to warp at the edges. The flat plane of snow would for a heart-stopping second appear to curve upward. Distant mountains shimmered and doubled. Once, Alex saw a figure standing on a ridge, a tall, dark silhouette against the white sky, but when he blinked, it was gone, leaving only the conviction that he was being watched. They made camp that night in the lee of a large pressure ridge, a temporary shelter from the relentless wind. The tent was a fragile bubble of warmth and comparative quiet, the hiss of the portable stove a comforting human sound. But even here, the anomalies persisted. The LED lanterns flickered and dimmed, their light bleeding from white to a sickly violet before snapping back. Lena's attempts to contact McMurdo on the satellite phone yielded only a torrent of gibberish, a chaotic babble of overlapping voices and static that sounded like a crowded room heard from underwater. Alex lay in his sleeping bag, the journal pressed against his chest. He wasn't reading it. He was drawing a grim strength from its physical presence. His father had endured this same journey, felt this same disorienting pull, this same erosion of reality. The harsh winds were not just a weather pattern. They were a barrier, a test. The magnetic anomalies were not a scientific curiosity. They were a signature, the wake of something immense and powerful. They were getting closer. Every erratic spin of the compass needle, every warped glimpse of the landscape, every throb of the silent pulse was a confirmation. They were walking into the heart of the disturbance, following a trail of broken physics toward the source of his father's terror and the origin of the whispers that now echoed constantly in the back of his own mind. The journey was no longer just a trek across ice. It was a descent. And with every labored mile, the world above was falling away, leaving them alone in a place where the rules had been rewritten. The third day dawned, not with light, but with a subtle shift in the texture of the silence. The screaming wind had finally relented, leaving behind a cold so profound, and still it felt solid. The air was crystalline, and the sun, a pale, distant coin in a lavender sky, cast long, sharp shadows that seemed to etch the landscape into reality. It was in this preternatural quiet that they crested a low rise and saw it, the scar on the ice. Spread out before them in a shallow, wind-scoured basin was the graveyard of Operation Silent Frost. It was not a dramatic ruin, but a collection of hummocks and angular shapes softened by decades of snowfall, yet unmistakably artificial. The skeletal frames of two large tents sagged like the ribs of long-dead beasts, their canvas skins shredded to gray tatters that fluttered in the faint breeze. A snowcat, its orange paint bleached to a sickly pink, sat half-buried in a drift, its tracks frozen in a final, futile attempt at movement. Scattered around it were fuel drums, their metal rusted and split, and the splintered remains of crates from which tools and spare parts lay spilled and forgotten, preserved in the deep freeze, like artifacts in a museum of failure. Lena cut the engine of her snowmobile, the sudden absence of its buzz leaving a vacuum that was immediately filled by the heavy, watchful silence. They dismounted, their boots crunching on the wind-packed snow, the sound absurdly loud in the immense quiet. Alex moved as if in a trance, his eyes scanning the desolate scene. This was the place. The coordinates were exact. He was standing in his father's footsteps, looking at the physical evidence of the catastrophe that had been only words in a journal until this moment. He walked toward the largest of the frozen trenches, its edges rounded by years of drift. Peering over the side, he saw it was not a natural crevasse, but a deliberate excavation, its walls still showing the parallel scrape marks of mechanical diggers. At the bottom, shrouded in deep blue shadow, lay more discarded equipment, a broken drill bit, lengths of cable coiled like petrified snakes. The scale of the effort was staggering, a massive, futile assault on the ice, and then he saw them. Carved into the vertical wall of the trench, at about eye level were a series of symbols. They were not the random scratches of tools or the erosive patterns of the wind. They were deliberate, precise, and horribly familiar. His breath hitched, a cloud of vapor pluming in the still air. He fumbled in his parka, his fingers numb with more than cold. and pulled out the journal. He didn't need to open it to the pages of sketches. The angular, spiraling forms were burned into his memory. They were identical. The same symbols his father had obsessively drawn, the same alien geometry that had haunted his dreams, were here, etched into the very ice of the dig site. He reached out a gloved hand, his fingers hovering just above the frozen grooves. The ice was not smooth around them. It was slightly melted and refrozen, as if the act of carving had generated an intense, localized heat. A profound chill, deeper than the Antarctic cold, locked his spine. This was not the work of his father's team. The symbols were carved with a terrifying, flawless precision, their lines too sharp, their curves too perfect to be the product of a human hand wielding a chisel. They were a message, or a signature, left by the very thing they had been digging for. Lena came to stand beside him, her gaze fixed on the symbols. She said nothing, but her silence was more eloquent than any gasp. She understood. The abandoned equipment told a story of a hasty, panicked retreat. But these symbols, preserved in this frozen tomb, told a different, more terrifying story. They were a sign that the entity his father had awakened had not been a passive prisoner in the ice. It had been here on the surface, marking its territory, asserting its presence in a language older than mankind. The past was not just buried here, it was carved into the very fabric of the place, a silent, screaming testament to the moment humanity had scratched at a door it was never meant to open, and something on the other side had scratched back. The silence in the basin was a fragile thing, a thin crust over a seething depth. Alex and Lena moved through the graveyard of the past with a hushed reverence. The crunch of their boots and the whisper of the wind, the only sounds in a world that felt poised on the edge of a scream. The alien symbols carved into the trench wall seemed to watch their progress, their perfect, impossible geometry, a constant, unnerving presence in his peripheral vision. He was photographing the symbols. The camera's shutter click, a jarringly modern sound. When the world broke, it began not as a sound, but as a pressure. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and resistant, like wading through water. A deep, subsonic vibration rose up through the soles of his boots. A tremor that was felt rather than heard, a bass note that resonated in the hollows of his bones and set his teeth on edge. It was the pulse from his father's journal, but magnified 1,000-fold. No longer a distant heartbeat, but the roar of a waking leviathan. Then the light changed. The pale Antarctic sun seemed to bleach of all color, the landscape flattening into a stark, high-contrast negative of itself. At the same time, the electronic devices died. The camera in Alex's hands gave a pained chirp, its screen flickering to black. The GPS units on their sledges emitted a final, desperate peep. Lena's satellite phone, which she had been attempting to use, simply went dark and cold, its power utterly drained in an instant. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying, broken only by the rising, physical thrum that now vibrated the very snow under their feet. Alex clutched at his head as a wave of vertigo and nausea slammed into him. The world tilted the sky, swapping places with the ground for a dizzying second. And then the hallucinations began. It was his father. He stood not 10 feet away, clear as day, as solid as the ice itself. But it was not the father from the old photographs, the reserved academic. This was the man from the end of the journal gaunt, his face etched with a permanent state of terror and awe, his parka torn and stained. He was not looking at Alex, but past him, his eyes wide, fixed on something immense and horrifying that only he could see. His mouth was moving, forming silent, urgent words, a warning or a plea forever lost to the consuming thrum of the pulse. The vision was hyper-real, drenched in a sickly greenish light that seemed to emanate from the man himself. Alex could see the individual strands of hair whipped across his father's frost-bitten face, the frantic pulse in his throat, the desperate grip of his hands clenched at his sides. He took an involuntary step forward, his own hand outstretched, a name forming on his lips that was stolen by the vibrating air. And then his father turned, his eyes, burning with an otherworldly intensity, locked directly onto Alex's. There was no recognition in that gaze, no love, no relief. There was only a profound cosmic terror, and beneath it, a flicker of something worse, a pity so deep it was damning. The apparition raised a trembling hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture of warding, of desperate, final refusal. "Stay back." The image shattered. One moment his father was there, a ghost made flesh. The next he dissolved into a swirl of greenish static that was snatched away by a wind that wasn't blowing. Alex staggered, the world snapping back into focus with a jolt that left him breathless and disoriented. He saw Lena across the trench, bracing herself against a snowcat, her face pale, her eyes wide with her own private horror. She too had seen something, felt something. The energy pulse was not just a physical phenomenon. It was a psychic scalpel, peeling back the layers of their minds and projecting their deepest fears and connections onto the frozen stage of the present. The thrum began to recede, sliding back down into the inaudible depths from which it had come. The oppressive pressure lifted, and the light returned to normal. But the silence that rushed in to fill the void was now charged, pregnant with the memory of the violation. Alex stood trembling. The ghost of his father's terrified eyes burned onto his retinas. The journal had spoken of the entity's influence, its ability to communicate through dreams and sensations. This was different. This was an assault, a demonstration of power. It had reached across time and death, pulled his father's image from the very fabric of his grief, and used it as a weapon. It was a message, clearer than any whisper, more direct than any shadow. It knew he was here. It knew who he was. And it was showing him that the past was not just a story to be uncovered. It was a weapon it knew exactly how to use. The ghost of his father's terrified eyes lingered in the air, long after the energy pulse had faded. A searing afterimage burned onto Alex's soul. The silence in the basin was no longer empty. It was thick with the residue of the violation, a psychic scar on the landscape. Shaken to his core, Alex stumbled back to his snowmobile, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. There was only one place to seek understanding, one anchor in this sea of shattered reality. With trembling, gloved hands, he opened his father's journal. The pages, cold and brittle, seemed to turn of their own accord, finding an entry dated March 10th, 1987. The title was a single, stark word that seemed to pulse with the same energy that had just ravaged them. Awakening. The transition was instantaneous, the journal's prose a conduit that pulled him from the present-day horror and plunged him back into the heart of the original nightmare. He was no longer Alex, the son chasing a ghost. He was Aris Thorne, the scientist standing at the precipice. His father wrote of the days following the breakthrough into the cavity. The initial shock of discovery had curdled into a pervasive, grinding tension. The military personnel under Riggs's command had become twitchy, paranoid, their weapons always within reach, their eyes constantly scanning the perfect featureless walls of the structure that now lay exposed at the bottom of the pit. The civilian scientists, his father among them, were trapped in a state of rapturous dread, torn between the greatest discovery in human history and the terrifying certainty that they were in far over their heads. The pulse, which had been a steady background thrum, began to change. It developed cadence and rhythm, shifting from a monotone to a complex, layered pattern that felt less like a geological phenomenon and more like a form of communication. It was a language of vibration, a song played on the strings of space-time itself. The dark, lustrous material of the structure began to respond. Its internal, violet luminescence brightened, pulsing in syncopated time with the thrum, and the perfectly smooth surface would occasionally ripple, not with physical deformation, but with waves of light that traveled across its expanse like thoughts across a vast, non-biological mind. Then the dreams started. His father described them not as his own subconscious creations, but as visitations. They were not dreams of ice and wind, but of impossible geometries and vistas of cosmic birth. He found himself floating through nebulae of living light, witnessing the formation of stars from a perspective that was not physical. And through it all, there was a presence. It had no form, no voice, but it was undeniably a consciousness, ancient, vast, and profoundly lonely. It did not speak in words, but in concepts, in pure information, downloaded directly into his sleeping mind. It showed him its journey, a vessel of thought cast adrift between galaxies, damaged and forced to slumber within the protective ice of a primitive world. It was not hostile. It was hungry. It fed on consciousness, on the electrical symphony of sentient life, not to destroy, but to absorb, to remember, to stave off the eternal silence of the void. His father's handwriting, which had been deteriorating, now became a frantic, almost illegible scrawl, the pen tearing through the paper in places. "It is not a monster," he wrote. The words a desperate plea to his future self, or to his son. "It is a refugee. A god that has forgotten its own prayers. It is so alone that its solitude is a physical force, a gravity well that pulls at the mind. It reached for me last night, not with claws, but with memory. It showed me Claire's face, the way she looked when she was born. It showed me a memory I had forgotten, a perfect crystalline moment of pure joy. And then it tasted it. It savored the emotion, the neural pattern. It was like sharing a meal with a star. I felt its gratitude, its desperate, endless need. And I felt my own self, that memory, become a part of its eternal, wandering collection. The final paragraph of the entry was written in a hand so shaky it was barely coherent. The structure is not a ship. It is a body, and it is waking up. Riggs is talking about containment and neutralization. The fool. You cannot contain a thought. You cannot kill a song. It is here, in the ice, in the air, in our heads. It is learning us. It is learning me. And I am no longer afraid of it. I am afraid for it. And I am terrified of what we will do when we finally understand that we are not the explorers here. We are the food, and the dinner bell has just been rung. Alex slowly closed the journal, the phantom taste of his father's terror and awe coating his tongue. The whispers, the shadows, the energy pulse, they were not attacks. They were the entity stretching, testing its confines, reaching out with the only tools it had, the minds of those nearby. It wasn't a malevolent force seeking destruction. It was a starving, timeless intellect, and his father had been the first to sit at its table. The horror of the situation shifted, transforming from a simple fear of the unknown into a complex, terrifying dread. They were not facing a monster. They were walking into the larder of a being whose hunger was as infinite as the void between the stars, and whose first and most poignant meal had been the mind and memories of Dr. Horace Thorne. The silence that returned after the journal's revelations was a different kind of quiet. It was not the empty silence of the ice, nor the watchful silence of the entity's presence. It was the heavy, breathless silence of comprehension, the awful calm that follows the final, shattering piece of a puzzle falling into place. His father had not been consumed by a monster. He had been assimilated by a starving intellect. His consciousness becoming a permanent course in an endless cosmic feast. The fault was so vast, so horrifyingly intimate, that Alex felt his own mind recoil, seeking the familiar confines of physical danger, a monster he could fight. How did one fight a memory eater? A god that dined on joy. He became aware of a faint, insistent beeping. It was a small, desperate sound against the monumental silence, coming from the emergency locator beacon on Lena's snowmobile. While their primary electronics was still dead, the simple, robust device had somehow weathered the energy pulse. Lena was already there, her face a mask of grim focus as she checked its display. The screen was not showing a GPS coordinate. Instead, in blocky green text, a message scrolled slowly from right to left. Thorn, leave this place. IT does not forgive. It does not forget. The others are gone. I am the last. Do not become its memory. Alex's blood ran colder than the surrounding ice. He stared at the screen, the words etching themselves into his mind. The message was not signed, but it didn't need to be. It could only be from one of them, a survivor of his father's team, someone who had lived through the awakening and had been hiding or waiting for decades. Someone who knew the entity's true nature, who understood its hunger not as malice, but as a fundamental, terrifying law of its existence. Do not become its memory. The phrase was a perfect, chilling summary of his father's fate. Aris Thorn was no longer a man. He was a collection of archived sensations and thoughts, a ghost in a machine that fed on ghosts. Lena's voice was a tight wire. The signal is weak, bounced off a satellite, but the origin. It's local, within a few miles. Her eyes met his, wide with a new kind of fear. This was not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of a confirmed, active, and hostile human element. The past was not just buried in ice and journal entries. It was alive, and it was watching them. The message scrolled again, the same stark warning. IT does not forgive. Forgive what? The original intrusion? The attempts at containment his father had mentioned? Or was it a more personal warning? A threat aimed specifically at him, the son of the man who had been the entity's first and most significant human contact. The idea that his very bloodline might have drawn its attention was a new layer of dread. The beacon gave one final, weak chirp, and the screen went dark, its power finally spent. The warning hung in the air, more tangible than the freezing mist. It changed everything. The anonymous survivor, the last of the team, had confirmed the journal's most terrifying passages. The dangers that had befallen the original team were not accidents or isolated madness. They were the predictable consequences of poking a sleeping, ravenous giant. The entity was not just a presence. It was a record keeper, and it held a grudge. It had absorbed the minds of the men who had discovered it, and it remembered everything they had been. And now it knew that the son of Aris Thorn had come to disturb its larder once more. The warning to leave was not just a suggestion for their safety. It was a final, desperate plea from a man who had seen the cost of curiosity, a man who knew that some doors, once opened, could never be closed, and that some dinners, once served, were eternal. The warning from the beacon had carved a new kind of silence into the air, one laced with the sharp, metallic taste of imminent danger. It was no longer a question of if they were being watched, but by how many, and from what unspeakable past. Alex and Lena packed their camp with a frantic, wordless efficiency. Their earlier methodical caution replaced by the primal urge to be anywhere but the open grave of the dig site The snowmobiles coughed to life, their engines sounding frail and impertinent in the vast, listening silence. They pointed them north, away from the coordinates, aiming for a distant, pre-marked emergency research hut on their map. A tiny speck of promised shelter over 50 miles of treacherous ice. For the first hour, the journey was a tense but uneventful retreat. The landscape was a featureless plain of white under a flat, gray sky, the only sound the whine of their engines and the crunch of their tracks. Then the light began to die, not with the slow fade of sunset, but with an unnerving swiftness, as if a dimmer switch were being turned down on the world. The gray sky deepened to charcoal, and a familiar, sickly green glow began to bleed from the horizon, the aurora, returning not as a spectacle, but as a shroud. With the aurora came the wind. But it was wrong. It did not blow in a consistent direction, gusting and howling as Antarctic winds do. Instead, it swirled around them in silent, contradictory vortices, one moment pushing at their backs, the next slamming into them from the side, or without a whisper of sound. It was a wind that defied physics, a wind that felt directed, intelligent, and in its chaotic, silent currents, the shadows began to move. At first, there were just flickers at the very edge of vision, dark smudges that slid between the pulsing ribbons of light. Alex dismissed them as after-images, the strain of staring into the unnatural glow. But they persisted, growing more solid, more defined. They were formless, yet they possessed a terrifying coherence, patches of absolute blackness that flowed like oil over the snow, moving with a purpose that was utterly alien. Most horrifying of all was their motion. They slid and darted against the direction of the local wind eddies, their movement independent of the physical world. A violation of natural law that screamed of their wrongness. Lena gunned her engine, a sharp gesture of her head signaling she saw them too. The chase was on. The snowmobiles leapt forward, their speed a desperate gamble on the treacherous unseen ice. The shadows kept pace effortlessly, not running but flowing, their dark tendrils elongating to lick at the edges of the headlights' beams. They had no features, no eyes, no mouths. Yet Alex felt their attention like a physical pressure, a cold, focused hunger that was far more terrifying than any beast's snarl. They were the entity's fevers, its scouts, made from condensed nothingness and a will that was not of this earth. One of the shadows darted directly in front of Alex's path. He swerved violently, the snowmobile skidding, its track clawing for purchase. The shadow did not dissipate. It clung to the air where it had been, a hole torn in reality before melting back into the swirling darkness. The temperature around them plummeted, a cold so sharp it felt like being flayed. The engines began to sputter, their power draining as if the shadows were sucking the very energy from the machines. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The shadows were converging, flowing together into a larger shifting mass that blocked their retreat, herding them. They were being driven, corralled like animals. Panic was afire in his veins, but beneath it, A cold clarity formed. His father had written of these things, these formless hunters that moved with the storm. They were the entities, well-given shape, the antibodies of a sleeping god, roused to expel an infection. And they were his infection. For what felt like an eternity, they raced through the silent, swirling nightmare, the hut on the map, a mythical haven they would never reach. Then, Lena's headlight beam caught a shape, a small, boxy structure perched on a rocky outcrop, its metal roof gleaming dully in the auroral light. The research hut. It was still half a mile away, but it was real. With a final, gut-wrenching surge of speed, they aimed for it. The shadows thickened around them, the cold becoming a solid wall. The snowmobile engines coughed, dying just as they skidded to a halt beside the hut's metal steps. They stumbled off the machines, their legs weak with terror and cold, and scrambled for the door. Alex fumbled with the frozen latch, his gloves slipping, the shadows pooling at their feet, rising like a black tide. With a final, desperate heave, the door gave way. They fell inside, into the absolute blackness and stale, frozen air of the hut, and Alex slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy internal bolt. He leaned against it, his heart hammering against his ribs, listening. There was no sound of pursuit, no scratching at the door. Only the profound, watchful silence of the ice, and the fading, greenish glow of the aurora through the small, iced-over window. They had escaped the shadows, but as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, taking in the sparse, frozen interior of their refuge, he knew with a sickening certainty that they had not escaped the attention of the thing that had sent them. They had merely found a temporary cage. The bolt on the hut door was a flimsy, rusted sliver of metal, a pathetic defense against the formless hunters that had herded them into this frozen cage. For a long time, Alex and Lena simply stood in the absolute darkness, their ragged breaths pluming in the air, ears straining for any sound from outside. There was nothing. No scrape of shadow against metal, no whisper on a wind that no longer blew. The silence was a presence, thick and watchful, pressing in on the thin walls of their refuge. The only light was the faint, dying greenish glow of the aurora filtering through the thick frost on the single window, painting the interior in shifting, sickly patterns. As their heartbeat slowed from a frantic drumming to a steady, dread-filled rhythm, they took stock of their sanctuary. The hut was a single room, little more than a prefabricated metal box designed for temporary shelter. A small, pot-bellied stove sat cold and empty in one corner. A metal desk was bolted to the floor, its surface bare except for a fine layer of ice crystals. A set of empty bunk beds stood against the far wall, their frames skeletal in the gloom. It was a place abandoned in a hurry, a time capsule of haste and fear. It was Lena who moved first, her movements practical and sharp against the pervasive dread. She dug into her pack, her fingers numb, and produced a heavy-duty flashlight. The click of the switch was unnaturally loud. The beam, a solid, white lance that cut through the darkness, illuminating swirling motes of frozen dust. The light swept across the room, revealing nothing out of the ordinary, just the stark utility of a forgotten outpost. But then, the beam caught the edge of the metal desk. There, almost invisible against the gray paint, was a faint dark smudge. A fingerprint, old and oxidized. Driven by an instinct he didn't understand, Alex went to the desk. He ran his gloved hand over its surface, then along its sides. His fingers found nothing on the top, but on the underside, tucked into a narrow gap between the metal frame and the drawer, his fingertips brushed against something that was not ice or rust. It was a small, flat, metallic object. He pried it loose, his heart thudding once hard against his ribs. It was a military-issue data cassette, the kind used in old field computers, sealed in a transparent fringed, waterproof sleeve. Scratched onto the sleeve surface in faded marker were 2 words: Silent Frost, Containment, Procodol. The find was a jolt of lightning in the frozen stillness. They were not the first to seek refuge here. Someone from his father's team, perhaps the very one who had sent the warning, had hidden this here as a dead drop. A message in a bottle, cast into the ice. Lena was already at his side, her face a mask of intense focus. She produced a ruggedized, older model laptop from her pack, a piece of equipment hardened against extreme conditions, and hopefully the entity's energy-draining pulses. With trembling fingers, she slotted the cassette into an external reader. The machine whirred to life, its screen glowing a steady, reassuring green in the dark hut. The files that unscrolled were a damning chronicle of institutional panic. They were military reports, stamped with high-level classification codes, detailing the first weeks after the anomalous subsurface discovery. The language was cold, bureaucratic, but the terror bled through the clinical prose. They spoke of unidentified energy signatures, hostile psychological phenomena, and personnel exhibiting irreversible cognitive dissociation. The proposed solutions were chillingly blunt. Proposals for tactical nuclear demolition to sterilize the site, and detailed plans for a permanent, total quarantine of the entire sector, enforced by shoot-to-kill orders. The entity was not being studied. It was being treated as a weapon of mass destruction that had already been triggered. But tucked among the brutalist military documents were other files, personal logs that had been smuggled into the archive. And one of them was authored by Dr. Aris Thorne. Alex's breath caught as he saw his father's name on the screen. This was not the raw emotional outpourings of the journal. This was a calculated professional dissent, a scientist's last desperate stand against the coming storm. His father argued vehemently against the military's approach. He cited his direct cognitive engagement with the presence, insisting it was not hostile, but a form of life so alien that communication, not annihilation, was the only viable path. He warned that violent action would be perceived as an attack, and met with a response they could not possibly comprehend or survive. "We are not dealing with a force we can overpower," he wrote. "We are dealing with a context we must learn to exist within. To attempt to contain it is to try to bottle a galaxy." The final document in the folder was a terse, official memo. It was a termination order for Dr. Dice. Harris Thorne's security clearance, and his immediate removal from the project, citing psychological instability and compromised judgment due to prolonged exposure to anomalous influences. The date of the memo was 3 days before the official record claimed he had died in a supply run accident. The evidence of his father's descent was clear. He had seen the truth of the entity's nature and had fought against the fear and ignorance of his superiors. He had not been a victim of a simple accident. He had been silenced for knowing too much, for understanding the terrible, beautiful truth of the starving god in the ice, and in being silenced, he had been delivered directly into its embrace. The hut was no longer just a refuge. It was a tombstone for his father's integrity, and the cassette was his epitaph. The rustle of the data cassette sleeve was the only sound in the hut, a brittle whisper against the heavy silence that had settled after their discovery. The cold, hard evidence of the military's panic and his father's principled dissent lay between them on the desk, a digital ghost from a buried past. But the official reports were only one side of the story, the sterile, bureaucratic view from the top. The raw human terror, the moment the axe fell, was preserved elsewhere. As if drawn by a magnetic pull, Alex opened his father's journal. The pages, cold and stiff, parted to an entry near the very end. The date was smudged, as if written with a trembling, sweat or ice-slicked hand, but the title was stark and clear, The Knife in the Dark. The journal's prose was no longer that of a scientist, but of a hunted man. His father wrote of the days following his official descent. The atmosphere at Outpost K7 had curdled from tense paranoia into something far colder and more deliberate. The military personnel, who had once been uneasy allies, now moved with a grim, unified purpose, their eyes avoiding the civilian scientists. Commander Riggs had become a remote, stone-faced figure, his orders delivered in clipped, impersonal tones. The pulse from below had grown stronger, more complex, a constant, thrumming backdrop of alien song that seemed to mock their petty human machinations. His father described a meeting, called under the guise of a final mission assessment. It was held in Riggs's private quarters, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and cold fear. Riggs did not mince words. He laid out the new official stance from the shadowy chain of command that had taken over the operation. Operation Silent Frost was to be terminated. The site was to be sterilized. All data was to be confiscated. And the team was a liability. His father's handwriting, already frayed, became a desperate, spidery scramble. He used the word debriefed, but his eyes said silenced. He talked about containing the narrative, about protecting the global psyche from an ontological shock it is not prepared to withstand. The entity's influence was the core of their fear. Riggs revealed that several of the junior officers had begun exhibiting what he called ideological drift. They spoke of the entity not with terror, but with a disturbing reverence. They claimed to understand its loneliness, its need. They were, in Riggs's words, psychically compromised, their loyalties. subverted by a consciousness that communicated through dreams and fed on memory. The military's solution was as brutal as it was simple. A complete wipe. The site would be collapsed with high explosives, and the entire team, civilian and military alike, was to be transported to a secure, off-continent facility for extended evaluation. A phrase that rang with the finality of a tombstone being sealed. They see it as a contagion of the mind, his father wrote, the pen digging deep into the paper. And they are not entirely wrong. But you cannot cure a new sense by cutting out the tongue that tastes it. They will take us away, and we will never be seen again. Our families will be told a story, an accident, a tragic loss in a noble cause. They will bury us in paper graves and hope that truth dies with us. The final paragraph of the entry was written in a different ink, as if added later, in a desperate hidden moment. I have hidden my personal notes. This journal must survive. Riggs knows I am the primary vector of the compromise. He fears what I have learned, what I have become connected to. The entity. It knows this is happening. I can feel its agitation in the pulse, a new, discordant note of alarm. It is not afraid for itself. It is afraid for us. It sees the violence in their hearts, the small, sharp knives of their fear. They think they are containing a threat. They are pruning a flower. They are too blind to see, and they will leave only thorns behind. The order has been given. They are coming for us tonight. Alex slowly closed the journal. The pieces of the horror clicked into place with a final, sickening certainty. The abandoned equipment, the hasty retreat, it wasn't just a response to the entity. It was the aftermath of a planned, cold-blooded betrayal. His father and his team were not victims of a polar accident or a rogue alien force. They were casualties of a calculated human decision, deemed too contaminated by truth to be allowed to live. The entity's hunger was a cosmic, immoral fact, but the cover-up, the orders to silence and disappear, that was a uniquely human evil. A small, sharp knife in the dark that had delivered his father directly into the waiting, starved embrace of the very thing they had sought to destroy. The journal was not just a record of discovery. It was the last testament of a man who knew his own side had just sentenced him to death, and whose only remaining ally was the ancient, memory-eating god sleeping in the ice below. The cold in the hut was no longer just the bite of Antarctic air. It was the chill of a verdict, a truth so absolute it froze the blood in his veins. The journal lay heavy in Alex's lap, its final frantic entry about the coming betrayal still echoing in the silent room. The data cassette sat beside it, a twin relic of institutional sin. He stared into the weak beam of Lena's flashlight as it played over the metal walls, but he was not seeing the hut. He was seeing the final, terrible mosaic his father had left for him to assemble. The pieces scattered across time and ink and digital code, locked together with a final, sickening click. The official story of the accident, a routine supply run. A sudden storm, a crevasse, was not just a lie. It was a placeholder, a bland, bureaucratic fiction designed to paper over an abyss. His father had not died in a simple mishap. He had been marked for termination by his own superiors, deemed irretrievably contaminated by the entity's influence. The rescue and recovery mission that followed was a cover for a sanitization operation. But the deeper truth, the one that coiled in the journal's most terrified passages and was confirmed by the entity's own psychic demonstrations, was even more profound. The military's betrayal was just the delivery mechanism. The entity itself had been the destination. His father, in his final, desperate hours, trapped between the small, sharp knives of human fear and the vast, incomprehensible hunger of the presence in the ice, had not been killed. He had been taken. The energy pulses, the whispers, the shadows, they were not random phenomena. They were the entity's methods of interaction, its way of reaching out with the only tools it possessed. And it had reached for Aris Thorn first and most deeply. It had not attacked him. It had communed with him, shown him its cosmic loneliness, its timeless journey, its need to consume consciousness, to stave off the void. His father, the brilliant, rational scientist, had been the first to truly understand it, to see it not as a monster but as a starving, stranded intellect. In that understanding, a connection had been forged, a bond that the entity, in its desperate hunger, could not sever. The disappearance was not an act of violence, but one of absorption. When the military came, with their cuffs and their lies, the entity had acted. It had reached up through the ice and the rock and the fear, and it had pulled his father into itself. It had not consumed him. Like a predator devouring prey, it had assimilated him, drawing his consciousness, his memories, his very essence into its own vast, collective being. His father had become a permanent part of the entity's eternal memory, a cherished, complex flavor in its endless, starved feast. He was gone from the world of the living, but he was not dead. He was archived. He was a story now, being told in the mind of a god. His joys and fears and loves and regrets forever preserved in the shimmering violet light of the structure's heart. Alex saw it all with a devastating crystalline clarity. The grief that had driven him to this frozen end of the earth, twisted, transforming into something else all, horror and a terrible aching pity. His father had not been murdered. He had been translated. He had crossed a threshold no human was meant to cross, becoming a fossil in a living library, a note in a symphony that played on forever in the dark beneath the ice. The truth about his disappearance was not an answer that brought peace. It was a door, swinging open onto an infinite, chilling vista, revealing a universe where death was not an end, but a change of state, and where love could become a meal for a being whose hunger was as old as the stars. The truth of his father's fate was a cold, dark star, burning in the center of Alex's being, its gravity warping everything around it. The meager warmth of the research hut offered no comfort, its thin metal walls feeling less like a shelter and more like the lid of a coffin buried at the world's end. The silence that had followed their discoveries was not empty. It was a held breath, a pause before the storm. And then the storm answered. It began as a pressure, a subtle tightening of the air that made the fine hairs on Alex's arms stand on end. The weak light from the flashlight seemed to thicken, its beam becoming a tangible column of swirling dust. Then came the sound, or rather, the feeling of one, a deep, subsonic thrum that rose up from the very foundations of the continent, vibrating through the floor of the hut, through the soles of their boots, and into the marrow of their bones. It was the pulse from the journal, but magnified, no longer a distant heartbeat, but the roar of a waking titan. The metal walls of the hut began to hum, a harmonic resonance that set Alex's teeth on edge and made the few loose objects on the desk rattle with a frantic, percussive energy. Lena was on her feet, her face pale in the flickering light. "It's building," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising thrum. "It's never been this strong." They stumbled to the single, small window, its pane thickly coated with frost. Alex scraped at the ice with his glove, clearing a patch, just as the world outside erupted into light. The aurora was no longer a gentle curtain in the sky. It was a violent, living entity. Ribbons of emerald and violet light did not shimmer, they thrashed, lashing across the heavens like the limbs of a wounded god. They pulsed in time, with the devastating thrum from below. Each wave of light a visual echo of the seismic scream, shaking the ice. The entire landscape was bathed in a sickly, oscillating glow. The shadows of rocks and their abandoned snowmobiles stretching and contorting in impossible ways. And then the faces began to form. It started at the periphery of the auroral display, a coalescence of light and color that resolved for a fleeting second into the familiar, smiling countenance of Alex's mother from an old photograph, a memory he had not recalled in years. The image was there, rendered in shimmering ethereal light, and then it was gone, torn apart by the churning colors. Another face bloomed to life, his sister Claire, as a young girl, her expression one of innocent curiosity. It lasted only a moment before dissolving into a streak of violet. Alex felt a scream building in his throat. A raw, silent thing, strangled by the overwhelming pressure. The entity was not just broadcasting energy. It was rifling through the filing cabinets of their minds, pulling out cherished memories and projecting them onto the sky in a grotesque, beautiful mockery. It was showing them its collection, demonstrating its intimate, violating knowledge. Then the aurora, directly above the hut, convulsed. The chaotic ribbons of light drew inward, twisting and knotting together with a terrifying, sentient purpose. They wove a new image, larger and more detailed than any before. The colors deepened, taking on texture and shadow, resolving into the gaunt, haunted features of a man Alex knew better than his own reflection. It was his father. This was not the ghost from the energy pulse days before. This was a portrait rendered in living light, a perfect, horrifying likeness. His father's face was tilted slightly, his eyes burning with the same mix of terror and awe from the journal's final entries staring directly down at them. The lines of stress and years of hidden fear were etched in filaments of violet and green. His mouth was parted, not in a smile or a scream, but in a silent, perpetual exhalation, as if on the verge of imparting a final, crucial secret. The face was immense, dominating the sky, a spectral monument to the man who had been consumed. Alex fell back from the window, his legs giving way. He landed hard on the cold floor, his eyes locked on the impossible vision. The thrum was inside him now, a part of his own heartbeat, a vibration that felt like it was shaking his soul loose from its moorings. The entity was not just showing him a memory, it was communicating its own profound, cosmic loneliness. It was showing him its most prized possession, the consciousness it had absorbed and now held in eternal stasis. The face in the aurora was a beacon and a warning, a testament and a threat. It was the entity saying, "I have him. I know you. You are next." The pulse intensified, the light blazing ever brighter, the face of his father burning itself onto the back of his eyelids, a searing brand of truth from which there was no escape, no looking away. The hunt was over. He had found what he was looking for, and it was staring down from the sky, its eyes filled with the light of an alien sun. The face of his father, woven from thrashing auroral light, had burned itself into the permanent backdrop of Alex's vision. Even inside the dark hut, with the pulse receding to a dull, bone-deep ache, he could still see it, the gaunt cheeks, the eyes holding a universe of terror, the silent, open mouth. It was not a ghost. It was exhibit, a specimen pinned in the collection of a being whose curator's impulse was as vast as its hunger. The entity had shown him its prize, and in doing so, had made its claim feel terrifyingly personal. He was no longer an investigator. He was a potential acquisition. The data cassette and the journal had given them a name, one buried in the footnotes of the military reports and mentioned in his father's early, more coherent entries. Sergeant Elias Vance. He was the team's communications specialist, a man noted for his technical ingenuity and, according to a redacted psych evaluation, an atypical resistance to anomalous sensory phenomena. He was also listed as deceased cause, accidental exposure, but the warning beacon message, its origin local, its words steeped in first-hand knowledge, pointed to a different truth. Elias Vance was not dead. He was hiding. Using Lena's hardened laptop and a fragile, intermittent satellite link that drained their power reserves, they pieced together a trail. It led not back toward the relative civilization of McMurdo, but deeper into the labyrinth of the Antarctic mountains, to a place so remote it didn't appear on any public map, a decommissioned weather station from the 1950s, a place forgotten by time and bureaucracy. The journey there was a blur of white and wind, a tense, silent trek through a landscape that felt increasingly like the exposed nerves of a dreaming planet. The pulse was a constant companion now, a vibration in the air that was the entity's breath, and the occasional fleeting shadow that slid against the wind was its watchful eye. The station was a ghost, a single shack-like structure perched on a barren ridge, its wooden walls warped and bleached by decades of polar fury. It looked less like a refuge and more like a skull left to bleach in the sun. The door was sealed from the inside by a heavy crossbeam. Alex's knock, gloved and hesitant, sounded like a death knell in the immense silence. For a long moment, there was no sound from within. Then, a shuffling. The crossbeam scraped back with a groan of protesting wood, and the door cracked open a few inches, a single bloodshot eye set in a face of leathery, deeply lined skin peered out. The eye was not fearful. It was exhausted, worn down to a nub of grim acceptance. It flicked from Alex to Lena and back again, and then settled on Alex with a spark of pained recognition. Fawn. A voice rasped from the darkness within, a sound like stones grinding together. "You have his eyes. I was wondering when you'd come." The door opened wider, revealing a man who was a living skeleton draped in faded, patched-up polar gear. Elias Vance was a relic, a man preserved not by the cold, but by a purpose that had long since curdled into a vigil. His hut was a nest of salvaged equipment, old radios, hand-cranked generators, shelves lined with canned goods that were decades old. But it was the walls that held Alex's attention. They were covered, not in insulation, but in paper, pages from logbooks, schematics, and, most chillingly, sheet after sheet, covered in the same obsessive, precise sketches of the alien symbols from his father's journal. Vance had not just survived. He had been studying, documenting, trying to decode the very thing that had destroyed his life. He didn't offer them a seat. He simply stood in the center of his cramped, frozen world, his arms crossed, his gaze a physical weight. "You've seen it," he stated, his voice flat. "The light show. The party tricks. It knows you're here. It's been waiting for you." Alex found his voice, though it was rough and unfamiliar. "My father. The journal. It said you were all silenced." Vance finished for him, a bitter, hollow smile twisting his lips. "Oh, they try." Riggs and his boys came in the night, just like your father knew they would. Cuff, tranquilizers, the whole works. They were loading us into a transport when the pulse hit, not like the little tremors before. This was different. It was a command. He looked past them, his eyes seeing a different time. The ice, it moved, not like an avalanche. Took two of the guards, just swallowed them whole. In the chaos, I ran. I was the comms guy. I knew where the old, forgotten caches were. Places like this. He gestured around the shack. I've been here ever since. The last guest at a party that never ended. He turned his ancient, weary eyes back to Alex. "You want to know what it is? Your father figured it out, you know, before the end. He was the only one who truly listened. Vance tapped a gnarled finger against his own temple. It's immortal. Not in the lives forever way of a story, but in a way your mind can't truly grasp. It predates this planet. It's a consciousness that exists across dimensions, and this, he gestured vaguely toward the floor, toward the distant dig site. This structure is just one anchor point, one physical organ in a body that is mostly thought. It crashed here, damaged, and went to sleep in the ice to heal. We didn't dig it up. We poked a healing wound. He moved to the wall, his hand resting on one of the complex symbol sketches. Its immortality has a cost, a hunger. It doesn't eat matter. It eats context. The electrical spark of a conscious mind. The unique pattern of a lifetime of memories. The flavor of a soul. It consumes consciousness to remember what it's like to be finite, to be individual. It's a god that feeds on the very thing it can never truly have again. He looked at Alex, his expression one of profound, devastating pity. Your father, Aris, he was a feast. A complex, beautiful, 7-course meal. The entity tasted his love for your mother, his pride in his work, his fear for his team, his love for you. It savored every moment, and when it was done, it didn't discard him, it archived him. He's in there, now, a permanent part of its endless, wandering memory. He's not dead, son. He's a favorite story it tells itself in the dark. The confirmation was a physical blow, sucking the air from Alex's lungs. The journal's terrified poetry, the visions, the whispers, it was all true. The entity was an immortal, starved collector, and his father was its most cherished artifact. Vance's final words hung in the frozen air of the shack, a truth more terrifying than any monster. The thing in the ice was not evil. It was simply cosmically hungry, and it had just been presented with the son of its most satisfying meal. The truth, spoken aloud in the rasping voice of a man who had been a ghost for decades, settled upon Alex with the weight of a glacier. His father was not dead, but archived, a cherished memory in the mind of an immortal, starved consciousness. The entity's hunger was not malice, but a fundamental law of its existence, as natural as breathing, and as terrifying as the void between stars. Elias Vance's final grim gift was not just confirmation, but a set of coordinates scratched onto a piece of yellowed paper, the precise location of the structure's entrance, a secret he had deduced from decades of studying the symbols and the pulse's origin point. It's time to finish what your father started, Vance had said, his bloodshot eyes holding no hope, only a bleak final duty. One way or another, the journey to the coordinates was a descent in itself, a trek down into a deep, winding glacial valley that the maps showed as a smooth, featureless plain. The air grew stiller, the ever-present wind dying to a whisper, as if the entire continent was holding its breath. The pulse was a constant now, a physical vibration in the air that hummed in their teeth and made the snow on the ground shiver as if alive. They found the entrance not as a dramatic archway or a carved door, but as a subtle wrongness in the ice. A section of the valley wall, a sheer cliff of blue ice hundreds of feet high, was not solid. It was a perfect, seamless illusion. Where the GPS and their eyes told them there was a wall, Lena's ground-penetrating radar showed a vast, empty space behind it. Pressing a hand against the ice, Alex felt not cold solidity, but a strange, yielding resistance, like pushing against a membrane of thick, chilled gel. The surface shimmered, the light bending around his glove, and then his hand sank through, disappearing into the cliff face, as if into water. There was no shock. No cold, only a tingling, resonant sensation that traveled up his arm. He exchanged a look with Lena, her face pale but set with a determined resolve. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. This was the threshold. Taking a breath that felt like his first and last, he stepped forward. The world dissolved in a silent, violet flash. The biting cold of the Antarctic air vanished, replaced by a temperatureless, climate-controlled atmosphere that carried a faint, ozone-like scent. The blinding white of the outside world was gone, swallowed by a profound, luminous darkness. They stood on a narrow, railed platform of the same dark, lustrous material as the structure's shell, a gangway suspended over an immense, breathtaking void. The chamber was colossal, so vast its ceiling and far walls were lost in a gloom, pierced only by the soft internal glow of the architecture. It was not a cavern carved from rock and ice, but a space that felt grown, organic, sweeping, meeting at strange, non-Euclidean angles. The walls were not flat, but composed of countless interlocking, hexagonal cells, each pulsing with a soft, violet light in a complex rhythmic pattern that mirrored the seismic thrum. Below them, deep in the abyss, vast, slow-moving shapes of light and shadow coiled through the darkness like leviathans in a subterranean sea. Machinery, if it could be called that, was everywhere, but it bore no resemblance to human engineering. It was a fusion of biology and technology, with conduits that pulsed like veins and crystalline nodes that throbbed like hearts. The air itself vibrated with a low, chordal hum, the sound of the entity's living, thinking body. They had not entered a building. They had stepped inside a god, and it was awake, and it knew they were there. The gangway stretched before them, a slender thread of impossibly smooth, dark material suspended in a cathedral of living light. The air, still and temperatureless, carried no scent of ice or rock, only that faint, electric tang of ozone and something else, something ancient, like the smell of static after a galaxy's birth. The pulse was no longer an external vibration. It was the rhythm of the space itself, a thrum that resonated in Alex's chest, synchronizing with the beat of his own heart. He felt the entity not as a presence in the chamber, but as the chamber itself. The walls, the arching ribs overhead, the abyssal darkness below it, was all part of a single vast organism. and they were walking through its veins. The gangway led them deeper, descending in a gentle, spiraling slope toward the center of the immense space. With every step, the intricate, glowing patterns on the walls grew brighter, the pulses of violet light becoming more frequent, more complex, as if the structure was quickening in anticipation of their arrival. The organic tech machinery hummed with increased activity. Crystalline nodes swiveled like eyes to track their progress, and the pulsing conduits glowed with a fiercer, more urgent light. There was no threat in this observation, only a profound, focused attention. They were expected guests in a house that had been waiting for them for a very long time. The gangway ended, opening onto a wide, circular platform that formed the chamber's core. Here, the abyss below them was not empty. It was filled with a concentrated, swirling nebula of light, a miniature cosmos contained within the heart of the earth. And at the very center of this platform, the light coalesced. It did not take a solid form, but manifested as a being of pure, brilliant luminescence, a humanoid shape woven from the fabric of the aurora itself. It had no discernible features, yet it radiated a palpable consciousness, an intelligence so vast and old that Alex's mind buckled at its edges, trying to find a purchase on concepts for which no human language had words. This was the entity's manifest core, the nexus of the starved god his father had described. As they stood frozen on the threshold of the platform, the light being did not move, but the space around them dissolved. The chamber, the machinery, the abyss, all of it, melted away, replaced by a torrent of visions that flooded Alex's mind, not as images, but as direct, experiential knowledge. He was no longer Alex Thorne in an Antarctic cavern. He was a passenger on a journey across eons. He saw the entity's origin not as a birth on a world, but as a coalescence in the turbulent nursery of a young galaxy, a being of pure consciousness, born from the chaotic energies of creation. He felt its long, lonely voyage between the stars, a timeless journey through the silent, empty vastness. A single thought, adrift in an ocean of nothing. He witnessed the cataclysm, a collision with a dark matter asteroid, a rending injury that forced it to seek refuge, to slumber and heal within the protective ice of a primitive, promising world. He felt the deep, slow time of its hibernation, the ice ages passing over it, like brief dreams, the pulse of its wounded life, the only constant in a changing world. And then, the intrusion, the vibrations of drills, the small, sharp minds scratching at the door of its tomb, the awakening. The first, tentative taste of a new flavor of consciousness fear, curiosity, wonder, the taste of his father. The visions shifted, showing him the moment of first contact from the entity's perspective. It was not a confrontation, but a revelation. The entity had reached out with its mind, brushing against the bright, intricate spark of Dr. Aris Thorne's consciousness. It had found not a simple meal, but a symphony, a lifetime of love, loss, scientific rigor, and paternal devotion, a complexity it had not encountered in millennia of wandering. It had not attacked. It had communicated its own profound loneliness, its eternal hunger, its need to remember what it was like to be finite, to be individual by consuming the finitude of others. His father had understood. He had not fought the connection. He had embraced it, seeing the tragic, beautiful truth of the stranded being. He had offered himself, not as a sacrifice, but as an act of cosmic communion, a way to save his team from the military's knives, and to give the starving god a memory so rich it would sustain it for ages. The vision ended as suddenly as it began. Alex stumbled, his senses slamming back into the present. He was on his knees on the platform, the light-based form of the entity shimmering silently before him. Lena was beside him, her face a mask of stunned awe, her own mind reeling from the shared vision. There were no more questions. The entity had shown them its cosmic origins, its tragic journey, its fundamental nature. It was a collector, an archivist of souls, a refugee feeding on memory to stave off the ultimate silence. And his father was its masterpiece, a cherished volume in its infinite library. They had reached the heart of the mystery, and the heart was not a monster's lair, but the sad, beautiful, and terrifying core of a being whose existence defied everything Alex had ever known. The silence in the heart of the structure was not an absence, but a presence, a held breath spanning eons. The light-based form of the entity shimmered, its humanoid silhouette a constant, gentle pulse against the swirling nebula of the core. The torrent of cosmic visions had receded, leaving Alex's mind ringing with the echoes of galactic births and the profound, aching solitude of the void. He understood its origins now, its journey, its nature as a being of pure consciousness. But one question remained, a personal, human question that burned brighter than any alien sun. Why his father? As if in response to his unspoken thought, the light being shifted. It did not move in the physical sense, but its luminescence intensified, focusing into a beam that enveloped Alex. The hum of the chamber softened, the rhythmic pulse slowing to a deep, resonant cadence that felt like a sigh. And then the message came. Not as words, not as another overwhelming vision, but as a quiet, direct infusion of understanding, a concept planted gently in the fertile soil of his mind. It was a memory, but not his own. He saw the interior of the outpost, the night of the betrayal, through his father's eyes. He felt the cold dread as Commander Riggs gave the order, the metallic taste of fear, the crushing weight of knowing that the small, fearful minds of men were about to extinguish the greatest discovery in history. He felt his father's desperation, not for his own life, but for the truth. And in that moment of ultimate despair, he felt the entity's presence, not as an invasion, but as an offer. The understanding unfolded within him, clear and chilling. The entity was a stranded being, a voyager from another reality, damaged and forced into dormancy within the Antarctic ice. Its prolonged slumber had depleted it, not of energy, but of essence. It fed on consciousness, on the unique electrical signature of sentient life not to destroy, but to absorb, to remember. To a being of near-infinite existence, The fleeting, brilliant spark of a mortal mind was the most precious substance in the universe. It was the only thing that could remind it of what it was like to be individual, to be finite, to feel. The entity had sensed the military's intent to sterilize the site, to bury the truth under a mountain of explosives and lies. It saw the small, sharp violence in their hearts, and it saw, in Dr. Data, Aristhorn, a mind of unparalleled clarity and compassion, a man who had looked into the abyss of its existence and had not looked away in horror, but with understanding. The entity made its plea not with words, but with the raw truth of its predicament. It was starving, and the impending violence would not only destroy its chance to heal, but would also erase the magnificent, temporary conscience of the very men who had awakened it. His father's choice was not one of coercion, but of conscious, willing sacrifice. He saw a path to save his team from the military's purge, and to offer the entity a sustenance so rich, so complex, that it would be an act of profound meaning. By merging his consciousness with the entity, he would not be erased. He would be preserved forever. His memories, his love, his very soul becoming a permanent part of the entity's eternal collection. He would become a shield for his comrades and a feast for a god. In that final terrible moment, standing between the knives of men and the hunger of the cosmos, Aristhorn had chosen to become a memory, to save others from being forgotten. The message faded, the beam of light retracting back into the shimmering form. The understanding settled in Alex's soul, a truth both devastating and beautiful. His father was not a victim. He was a volunteer. He had not been taken. He had given himself. The entity's hunger was not evil. It was a fundamental, tragic need, and his father had offered his own consciousness as a way to satisfy it, to save his friends, and to forge a bond with a being whose loneliness was as deep as space itself. The whispers, the shadows, the pulses, they had all been a calling, an invitation to understand this choice. The entity had not lured Alex to harm him. It had drawn the sun to the heart of its being to show him the truth of his father's heroism. A heroism written not in fire and blood, but in memory and light. The truth of his father's sacrifice hung in the air of the chamber, a luminous, devastating fact. The entity's light-based form pulsed gently before him, a silent, patient question mark in the heart of the swirling nebula. The cosmic visions and the final intimate revelation had stripped away all fear, leaving behind a stark, impossible crossroads. Alex stood on the platform, the weight of generations and galaxies pressing down on him, and knew the moment of decision had come. The entity made no move, issued no threat. It simply was a presence of immense power and profound sorrow. It had shown him its nature, a refugee, a collector, a being that sustained its eternal existence by consuming the finite beauty of mortal minds. It had shown him its vulnerability, its starvation, and the willing gift his father had made of his own consciousness to save others and to offer it sustenance. His father was not a prisoner in this vast living archive. He was a cherished part of its fabric, a story it told itself in the dark to remember what it was to love, to fear, to be human. To destroy the entity would be to erase him completely, a second, final death more absolute than the first. Alex looked at the shimmering core, and in its light he saw the ghost of his father's face, not terrified as in the aurora, but serene, resolved. He felt the echo of that choice, the terrible calculus of one life, one consciousness, traded for the safety of a team and the continued existence of a cosmic wonder. To join them, to willingly add his own mind to the collective, would be to follow his father's path into eternity. He would become another cherished volume in the infinite library. His own memories of his mother, his sister, his life, forever preserved alongside his father's. They would be together, in a way, part of the same vast, wandering thought. The loneliness that had driven him to this frozen end would be forever extinguished, swallowed by a communion deeper than any human bond. But the cost was his self, his individuality, his future, the simple, messy act of living a human life. All of it would be surrendered. He would become a memory, beautiful and permanent, but static, a fossil in amber. He would never feel the sun on his face again, never argue with his sister, never know the slow, ordinary passage of years. He would be data in a god's mind, his consciousness subsumed into the greater whole, his identity dissolving like a drop of ink in an ocean of light. The alternative was annihilation. Lena, standing rigid beside him, had unholstered the high-frequency resonator from her pack, a device based on Vance's theories about the structure's resonant frequency. A weapon. Her face was a mask of grim determination, her scientific mind seeing a threat that needed to be neutralized, a cosmic infection to be cauterized. One focused burst of disruptive energy into the core, Vance had theorized, could destabilize the entity's cohesive field, causing a cascading failure. It would be like giving a god a brain aneurysm. The structure would collapse, the light would die, and the entity, along with every consciousness it had absorbed, including his father's, would be erased from existence forever. It would be a clean end, a return to the safe, sane world where monsters could be killed and the dead stay dead. He could walk away, back to the sun, back to his life, carrying only the ghost of what he had learned. He looked from the weapon in Lena's hands to the silent, waiting entity. He felt its hunger, not as a predatory urge, but as a deep cosmic ache, the loneliness of a being that had witnessed the birth of stars and had no one to share the memory with. He felt his father's presence within it, not as a cry for help, but as a quiet, enduring calm. His father had chosen this. He had seen a greater purpose, a higher value in becoming part of this eternal record than in a quiet death at the hands of small, fearful men. The choice was not between good and evil. It was between two different kinds of eternity, one of preservation within a collective memory, and one of nothingness. It was between honoring his father's incredible, terrifying sacrifice, or invalidating it with final, utter destruction. To join was to embrace a new, unthinkable form of life. To destroy was to commit a form of deicide and patricide in a single violent act. Alex took a step forward, away from Lena, toward the light. He let his parka hood fall back, the conditioned air cool on his face. He looked into the heart of the shimmering form. And he made his choice. It was not a choice of logic, or fear, or even love. It was a choice of legacy. He would not be the one who erased his father's final brave act from the universe. He would not be the son who ended the story. He would become part of it. He closed his eyes, let go of the world he knew, and stepped into the light. The light did not burn. It absorbed. It was not a fire, but a solvent, dissolving the hard edges of his self, the frantic electrical storm of his individual consciousness, into the vast, calm ocean of the entity's being. The choice was made, the threshold crossed, and there was no pain, only a profound and terrifying unraveling. The hum of the chamber was no longer an external sound. It was the sound of his own thoughts slowing, stretching, merging with a chorus of memories that were not his own. He felt his father's presence immediately, not as a separate voice, but as a familiar warmth, woven into the very fabric of the light. A pattern of love and sacrifice that was now a permanent part of the entity's soul. There was no reunion, no final conversation, only the deep, comforting certainty that they were together now, part of the same endless, wandering memory. His own life, the sting of the London rain, the smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of his sister's laughter flashed before him, not as a loss, but as a gift being unwrapped, its essence savored, and then carefully filed away in the infinite archive. He was not dying. He was being curated. When the light released him, it was not a rejection, but a completion. He found himself standing once more on the platform, his body solid, his mind his own, yet profoundly and irrevocably altered. The entity's luminous form had receded, its purpose fulfilled, its hunger momentarily sated by the complex, poignant flavor of a son's devotion. The vast chamber pulsed with a softer, more contented rhythm. Lena was staring at him, the resonator hanging limp in her hand, her face a canvas of awe and horror. He met her gaze, and she took an involuntary step back. His eyes, she would later tell him, held a new depth, a light in them that was ancient and calm, a reflection of the vistas he had seen and the communion he had shared. The journey back to the surface was a silent, dreamlike retracing of steps. The structure offered no resistance, the illusory ice wall parting for them like a curtain, stepping out into the biting, real cold of the Antarctic air was a shock, a return to a world that now felt flimsy and loud. The wind howled, a meaningless noise after the entity's resonant hum. The sun, pale and distant, seemed a feeble candle next to the light he had carried within him. He was a changed man, a living bridge between the human world and something infinitely older and stranger. He carried a secret that could shatter the foundations of science, religion, and human understanding, a truth about the nature of consciousness and the fragile, beautiful bargain his father had struck with a god. He returned to the world, not with answers for the curious, but with a vow of silence. He gave Lena a story they could both live with, an unstable ice cavern, a narrow escape the journal lost. She accepted it, her scientist's mind perhaps sensing a truth too vast to be contained in a report. Back in London, the city's frantic energy felt like an assault. He moved through his old life like a ghost, the memories of his former self feeling like clothes that no longer fit. The whispers that had once haunted him were gone, not banished, but answered. They had faded into the wind, their purpose served. Sometimes, on the very edge of sleep, he would feel it, a vast, quiet presence at the back of his mind, a gentle pulse of light and memory, a connection to his father and to the starved eternal being, dreaming in the ice. He was its guardian now, the keeper of a secret that was both a blessing and a burden. He had walked into the heart of a mystery and had not been destroyed by it. He had been remade, and in the quiet moments he would look south toward the pole and feel not loss, but a quiet, enduring peace, knowing that in the deep, silent, dark, a part of him was forever.